to why we're all here. Jacob Goldsmith is the coordinator of the Emerging Adulthood program at the Family Institute. Dr. Goldsmith developed the Emerging Adulthood program to help understand and meet the changing needs of emerging adults and their families. He has been privileged to speak and consult nationally and internationally on topics related to emerging adulthood, adult parent-child relationships, psychotherapy, change processes, and empirically informed therapy. And we're delighted to collaborate on today's webinar with the Family Institute at Northwestern. The Family Institute is a behavioral health group practice committed to whole health for individuals, families, and couples. Located in Chicago, Evanston, Northbrook, and Westchester, the Family Institute is an organization of educators, researchers, and therapists partnering with their clients to see change. And with that, Jacob, thank you so much for being here. I will pass it off to you.
Thank you so much, Cassie. Thanks, everyone, for joining me today. This is a topic that is really meaningful and exciting for me. One of the things that's been so great for me about coming to the Family Institute from a college counseling center training background is realizing that working with folks in their 20s, I really also needed to work with parents and families. And now I have a chance to do that. That's what I'll be talking about today, building strong relationships between emerging adults and their parents. And I want to start with a clinical example. Like all of my examples, this is a completely fake family for obvious reasons, but who I have given real problems. They're the Carlson family. Parents are Maura and John, and their 25-year-old daughter, Claire. Maura and John met in college. They married soon after. They're a close-knit family throughout all of Claire's adolescence, growing up. They have a strong sense of shared values. Claire was a really driven athlete through college, but in the 20s, she was off track and listless, and the family really didn't know how to respond. And they came in with what I would call a very common problem, saying our strengths have become our weaknesses. So these are parents who feel like many parents do, that the work that they put in to build closeness, to give their kids leeway and support, may have backfired when their kids feel off track in their 20s. Now, I'm bringing this up not to fearmonger and to sort of predict gloom and doom. I'm bringing up a family like this in part because I think this is a really typical problem and a really typical set of feelings for families to experience. And I think that the lessons from a family like this are really applicable to families who are doing well. You know, the transition to adulthood is taking longer and longer, and it's not just young adults feel lost. Strong parent-child relationships are critical for the whole family. So when kids feel off track, parents can also feel lost and off track. And obviously, when parents feel like they're on track and oriented, they can do the best job of helping their emerging adults transition to adulthood gracefully. There are a couple of things that I try to plug with families that I think are really helpful. One is shared understanding. And this is a couple of things. So think about shared understanding in terms of understanding what's normal and what's not in emerging adulthood. We can also think of shared understanding in terms of understanding each other as a family. And what underlies all of that, strong communication skills. So plain and simple, if a family comes into therapy and they have really big, significant problems, but they're really good at communicating, we tend to take care of those problems pretty easily. On the other hand, if a family comes in and they have relatively minor problems, but they have really good, really bad communication skills, then we have more trouble treating that case. So I tend to plug communication skills as the best sort of preparatory and prophylactic approach to building strong families in emerging adulthood. Here's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about emerging adulthood, why it is that we use that term in particular. I'm going to talk about what families can and should expect. I'll talk about what's normal and what's not. So all of that goes into sort of building shared knowledge. And then I'm going to present two different conversations that I think you could leave the webinar and have as a family now, that I think would sort of build all of the skills that I'd want you to foster. One is a conversation about roles, and the other is a conversation about giving support. So the roles conversation is a little more sort of heady and intellectual and theoretical. The support conversation is very, very grounded in behavioral. Let me define emerging adulthood. So probably if you're attending this webinar, you've read one or more articles about how emerging adulthood, transition to adulthood, is taking longer, right? So in the 60s, the average age of marriage in the States was about 2021. Now, depending on where you live in the US, it's somewhere between 29 and 30. It's a little higher in urban areas. So young adults are taking longer to marry. They're taking longer to reach a sense of adult identity. So much so that researchers have identified this as a new developmental stage called emerging adult. So for context, if we went back 150 years, people wouldn't really understand what we meant by adolescence. So you sort of went from childhood directly to adulthood. And with cultural and economic changes, there was a change in how human development happened, where we go from childhood into adolescence into adulthood. So now we can think about a similar thing happening: childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood as a distinct stage, and then adulthood. So what's the same and what's different? Well, ultimately, the goal of transition to adulthood, the goal of emerging adulthood, is the same for me as it is for all of you, as it is for any of our kids, right? It's to develop self-identity. And chiefly that's in two areas: self-identity for work and self-identity for love. So self-identity for work doesn't necessarily mean figuring out what you want to do for a living. It really means how you want to be in the world as someone who works, right? So you can know where you're headed and not be in your final job, but still have a self-identity for work. Self-identity for love, similarly, doesn't necessarily mean getting married, but it does mean figuring out who you want to be as a partner, as someone who loves and interacts and is in the world in that way. So overarching goal, the same: self-identity. What's different? Chiefly, obviously, the length of time spent in transition. However, because people are in transition for longer, there is more fluctuation, and at the same time, there are less distinctions in development. So the 20-something folks who I work with, or even folks in their early 30s, will talk about feeling like even when they're in a job, there are less distinct rungs on the ladder that they're climbing to move to some end goal, say, compared with folks who I work with in their 40s or 50s. Now, there's a lot of conversation about why this happens, and I think a lot of misinformation. A lot of these changes seem to be due to economic and cultural changes, as opposed to, say, kids these days are just lazy or something like that. There are some differences in individual values, but not that's not the chief reason for this change. So this is a response to economic and cultural changes on a really large scale. Jeffrey Arnett is, I think, the best theorist who's talking about this life stage right now. And he talks about 5 qualities of emerging adulthood. The first is identity exploration. So this is a period of time that is defined in terms of identity exploration, right? So not just identity achievement, but this is a period of exploration, which means by definition, it'll be a period of some instability. If you're exploring and trying to figure out who you are, that is going to be inherently at least a little bit unstable. You might try different jobs, you might be in different relationships, different sorts of relationships. So that piece is very natural. Emerging adults also tend to feel stuck between two worlds, stuck between adolescence and adulthood. Some days they feel like adults, other days they feel like adolescents. There's less that clear distinction that a lot of us would have experienced growing up. It's also a period of time of intense self-focus. I think this is part of the reason why there's a lot written about selfishness among emerging adults. I think that's a misunderstanding of self-focus. You know, if you're not married, you don't have a mortgage, and you're trying to figure yourself out, right? You're in a period of life where you're trying to build a self-identity. You're going to spend a lot of time thinking about yourself, right? You're not as beholden to other people. So self-focus is natural. Finally, it's a period of infinite possibilities. And I say this is a little tongue-in-cheek, right? I had a client who described adulthood as standing in front of a giant buffet with thousands of choices, but essentially feeling like at any given time he had to make the perfect choice of what to choose. So infinite possibilities is great when you feel good about yourself, not so great when you feel anxious. I want to talk then about what families can expect. So there's been a lot written about emerging adulthood, much less written about what families can expect. So this is a model for what families can expect. So in emerging adulthood, the whole family is in transition. We all go through transition. And we experience that in a lot of different ways. So we can expect fluctuations in closeness, both literal and figurative, right? So emerging adults are living further from their parents than they ever have. They also may feel more or less emotionally close to their parents. I think a lot of times parents and emerging adults have trouble identifying with each other because parents feel like they went through the process one way, and now their emerging adult children are going through the process in a different way. To feel like an adult, children often need to push away. It's really clearly in adolescence, right? So kids, adolescent or childhood differentiation takes place like this. I can't be me when I'm around you, mom and dad, so I need to push you away. Totally natural for adolescence. But emerging adult differentiation can't work like that, right? That's not how adult relationships work. I need to learn to be me and also to be really close to you, right? So think about there's this tension between distance and closeness. Well, the longer transition to adulthood really complicates this because it means that emerging adults and their parents are logistically, emotionally, and financially entangled for longer. So right in this period of time, I'm needing to push away a little bit to discover myself. At the same time, I'm needing to lean harder on my parents because I feel stuck between two worlds. Basically, this gets really complicated. The other piece that I want to highlight here is this is a period of time that requires role flexibility. So when I talk to parents, they will often say one day they feel like they need to be a coach, the next day they need to be a leader, the next day they're a banker, then the next day they feel like their emerging adults want them to be a confidant, and they feel just sort of whipped around into these different roles. Finally, for a lot of families, there's the loss of the idealized parent and child. So this is, for emerging adults, this is when your parents come off the pedestal and become real people. And for parents, right, this is when our kids come off the pedestal and become real people. Let me then sort of review this and talk about what's normal and what's not. And this is the stuff that I'd like you to have in your mind when you're having conversations with your emerging adults. First and foremost, instability is normal. But we need to be able to tell the difference between instability and anxiety, or instability and insecurity. So just changing jobs, just being in a relationship and deciding it doesn't work and leaving that relationship, that's instability. That's not inherently problematic. Losing a lot of sleep over it, feeling chronically anxious about the future, that's problematic. That's anxiety. It's often really hard to tell the difference. And as parents, what we can do is just maintain an open stance and be able to talk to kids and really, frankly, talk honestly about, is this instability or is this anxiety? I assume this should be obvious, but I'm going to say it, right? Parents, we can't remove instability. And we should be careful not to communicate that instability is wrong. I think when we imply that sort of the clock is ticking and why aren't our kids there yet, we imply that instability and exploration are wrong. And frankly, for some people, when it morphs into anxiety, it isn't great. But we don't want to just blanket imply that instability is wrong. Families need to talk about exploration, and we need to talk about the difference between exploring and being lost. And that's going to sound a little different for each family. Role shifts are also normal, and we can really practice role flexibility. I always say, because we minds, we have to talk about this stuff. So I don't know what role I need to be in. You need to tell me what role I need to be in. We need to communicate to facilitate role shifts. So I think for a lot of emerging adults who still feel stuck in adolescence, they're used to their parents adopting a role and taking the lead. And what I do a lot as a therapist is encourage emerging adults to be very clear about what sort of roles they would like their parents to be in. And parents need to be clear what roles work and don't work within the family. And they need to sort of get out of the driver's seat a little bit there to let the emerging adults take the lead in facilitating the role shifts. I'm going to talk later about how to have a conversation about this in some more depth. What's normal and what's not? Needs and boundaries are normal and necessary. I take a good fences make good neighbors approach to adult boundary setting. It is appropriate to have needs. A lot of families come to me and they say, well, I'm cautious about talking about needs explicitly because I don't want to come off as needy. To me, when you don't talk about needs, that infinitely raises the chance that you're going to come off as passive aggressive or needy. Talking about needs doesn't make you needy. Having needs doesn't make you needy. Sort of not talking about needs and insisting that people can mind read and understand your needs probably makes you needy. I think parents can do a fabulous job of appropriate boundary setting in emerging adulthood, right? So emerging adults may struggle to set boundaries. Parents, we can show appropriate boundaries by being super clear about our own needs and wants. Frankly, it's really okay to have a conversation in which you say, this is what it means to be a part of this family. These are rights and responsibilities to one another. I think a lot of parents don't want to do that because they worry that it's infantilizing, but having that conversation can in fact be really liberating because it shows us what's okay and what's not okay. So in that context, let me come back to the Carlson family. When the parents said our strengths have become our weaknesses, what did they mean? They were super close as a family. And then there was this dropping closeness. Daughter goes to college. She needs to push away. It's a really natural process. But it really came as a surprise to everyone, including the daughter. What happens a lot of times then is rather than taking the time to rebuild adult closeness, either the parents rush in or the emerging adult sort of freaks out and rushes back in. So everyone wants to be connected. No one really knows how. And there's this process of intrusion and rejection, intrusion and rejection. The parents felt stuck and ineffective in the room. So in this family, and this is very typical, we have a family where dad felt like he was the problem solver and mom felt like she was the caretaker. But as the daughter got older, she actually really wanted dad to do more caretaking because she was still working out some of the stuff with her closeness with mom. And dad felt like he knew how to be a problem solver, but not a caretaker. And that's a problem. It's a problem that I thought, frankly, I see this personally in my own life where, you know, I had really good training as a problem solver, but even though I'm a therapist, I'll still often fall back on problem solving instead of caretaking. So I think it's just practice to get into new roles. The other thing that this family experienced, that a lot of families experienced, was problems giving and receiving support. So the parents wanted to foster autonomy. And the daughter obviously wanted her own autonomy, but she also felt freaked out about money. And so you've got parents who want to give money if it's helpful, but don't want to give money if it's hindering. Again, they don't know how to talk about it. When I tell you about the conversation about giving and receiving support, I'll go into that in more detail. And the last thing that happened is pretty typical. This family only wound up talking deeply when things were in crisis. And that's just not a pattern that you want to fall into. You want to practice conversation when things are calm so that you have practice with these techniques before you're in crisis. Part of the reason why I chose a family like this as an example is that in many ways, this family's in really right. They still like each other. They want to be connected. They still have common values. They just really don't know how. This is really common for families that feel lost. And frankly, the solutions that I would say for them are the same solutions that I would give to families who are in really good shape, who are just wanting preventatives. One, really good education on the state of emerging adulthood. So for example, with the Carlson family, first and foremost, helping them understand that the role changes and the fluctuating closeness were normal and expected, right? And then get them talking and feeling connected when things were calm and good. So getting away from only talking when things were in crisis. There would probably be 5 or 6 different conversations I'd lead them through. One about shared history, about values, about problem solving, and then the 2 that I'm going to highlight today for you all, the conversation about roles and the conversation about support. So again, if you take only one thing away from this today, is that you can go home and you can have these conversations as a family. The reason I like conversations is that they build both in communication skills, right? So when we talk, we learn about each other, which is great, and we're also practicing good communication, which is great. And the insight and the communication sort of build on each other. So the better I understand you, the better I'm able to empathize with you, the better I'm able to be connected with you, and that drives our conversation deeper, which is really cool. So if you think about this, what do families need to do to be connected? They need to understand each other. They need to understand themselves. They need to understand all those connections, so who they want to be as a family. And they need to be able to talk to each other. And good communication really builds all of those things, right? So by doing this, you're sort of touching on all of the basic self-understanding, other understanding, relational insight, and communication skills that underlie close family relationships. Here are some basic guidelines. First and foremost, this need to happen in person. Could you do Skype or Zoom? Yeah, it's harder. Nonverbal skills really, really help intimate conversation. Whatever you do, don't try to have these conversations via email or text. They don't work that way. If things feel tense or you feel like people aren't listening, then you want to use what's called the speaker-listener technique. That goes like this. If I'm the speaker, I piece, and the rest of the family are the listeners. Now, if someone else wants to talk, they become the speaker, and the first thing they need to do is repeat back to me what I just said. This is a basic empathy technique. So I would say, let me give you an example. I would say, I'm very angry because my daughter said she was going to come to a family gathering and she canceled at the last minute without telling me. So now my daughter, okay, so you're angry because I didn't come. I say, well, wait a minute. No, I'm not angry because you didn't come. You're allowed to come or not come. I'm angry because you said you were going to come and you didn't show up and you didn't call. And my daughter would hopefully say, I get it. You're angry because I didn't call, right? So the speaker-listener technique ensures that whoever is speaking actually feels heard. And it means that people aren't sort of sitting around sharpening their knives trying to decide what to say next, but they're really listening. And so after the other family member would reflect, then that person becomes the speaker and they say their piece. Part of what I want you to do in these conversations is to practice good self-awareness. That means attending to your body as you're talking, noticing what you're feeling, noticing what you're thinking. These are all really good insight building cues. And the magic question that you want to ask yourself before the conversation is, how do I want about myself when the conversation is over? Don't think about what do I want these other people to learn. Don't even think necessarily about what outcome you want in terms of the interpersonal material in the conversation. If you just start with how do I feel about myself, then you're oriented towards really sort of being in touch with your own thinking and feelings. That helps calm down and reduce the anger a little bit, and helps us behave in ways that are consistent with our values. Okay, conversation number 1, conversation about roles. Always set a goal for your conversation. My goal here would be to deepen understanding of family roles, right? So we might start by talking about what are our roles. Coach, confidant, supporter, student, teacher, sparring partner, maybe. Sort of get out there, what are some different roles that we've been in? And I would start the conversation by saying, if you had to pick one to describe your role in the family growing up, what would it be? So in the Carlson family, the example that I gave, dad might say, my role in the family growing up was problem solver. Mom would say my role was caretaker. And Claire, their daughter, would say my role was student. Okay. Then we can start to talk. How did that change over time? Right? How did it change from situation to situation? And then more importantly, why did it change from situation to situation? The cue that you're getting deep in these conversations is that you're getting down to the why. So knowing that dad was most comfortable in the problem solver role doesn't tell us all that much. It's a pretty typical gendered role in heterosexual couples. Knowing why dad in particular was comfortable in that role within the family is really important. Okay, then we move to the present. How are our roles different now? And again, the goal is to get to why. We can go a step deeper. Are there roles that we particularly like? Are there roles that make us really uncomfortable? And these sorts of questions get at what's stopping the constraints from us changing roles as necessary. I like to ask, what do I know about myself? What do you know about yourself that helps you get into the role that you need to be in, right? So maybe it's really hard to be empathic, especially when my kid's in pain, because I want to jump in and problem solve. So what do I know? What can I tell myself? How do I get in the mood to be in that role that I need to be in? So that's the conversation about roles. Why is this important? When we have a conversation about roles, we're talking about the ways of relating that make us comfortable and uncomfortable. We're talking about something pretty deep here. We're talking about the assumptions that we make about our own and each other's needs and desires. So if I'm always in a problem solver role, I'm treating you as though you're always needy. On the other hand, if I can get into sort of a coach or a confidant or a peer role, I'm treating you as though you are competent and confident. So roles say a lot about how we see each other. The other thing we're doing here is we're talking about our feelings, right? And so for a lot of families, look, for some families are really comfortable with this, other families aren't. But I would say if you want to know what helps you build strong relationships, getting to a point where you can talk about your feelings and your needs is really important. It fosters intimacy, and intimacy is really the driver of good adult relationships. So this is a conversation that builds intimacy. On the other hand, the second conversation really isn't a conversation about intimacy. It is a very pragmatic conversation, for lack of a better word. It's a conversation about support. And the goal here is to help families talk about if and when to give support, right? So we could be talking about financial support or logistical support, but essentially, do families give or not? Let me define two terms here, enabling and facilitating. So enabling is a bad thing. It's providing support in a way that hinders development. So if I give my kid money, so let's say my kid comes to me and says, Dad, I know you wanted me to get a summer job, but I don't want to get a summer job. I want to take this fun class that I've found because I think it's going to really help my career development. But then, you need to pay for me to live during this. Now, enabling would be saying if I give my kid the money to do this class and instead my kid screws around, doesn't learn anything, and it ultimately hinders his development, that's enabling. On the other hand, if I give my kid the money to do the class, he does the class, it lights a fire under him, and he goes and gets a really great job afterwards, I would say that's facilitating, right? I'd say that's a really good investment. The thing is, there's no clear-cut behavioral difference here, right? You have to know your kid in order to know whether giving, in this case, giving money would be enabling or facilitating. So 3 basic steps to get there. 1, what do I know about my kid and my family that will support is appropriate? Right? So no book is going to tell you if and when to give financial support. You have to start by looking at history. When I've bailed my kid out in the past, what has happened? When I've given support in the past, does my kid take the ball and run with it? Or do they tend to just sort of take it and sit on their butt? Who's in the driver's seat? So in the early 20s, I think a lot of families, the parents are the driving force of giving support. but as quickly as possible, I really want to see the emerging adults in the driver's seat, right? So as soon as possible, I want it to be my kid who's coming to me to say, I want you to give me this much support in this sort of way, and here's what I'm willing to do with it. So I'd feel much more comfortable giving support if they're in the driver's seat. And then I think you need to ask directly, am I intervening in a way that's likely to foster growth? Right? Am I enabling or facilitating? And parents, this is not a conversation that has to happen behind closed doors, right? If you've got a good relationship with your kids, I think you need to involve them in the conversation about enabling and facilitating. You need to talk to them about your fears, and they need to give you really good reasons why the problems aren't going to occur. And in that case, I think it's appropriate to give support. Let me say one other thing about support. So there's some research, there are really one or two great studies on financial support from millennials and even younger kids. Basically, what it shows is that families are giving support for longer now, not surprising. But surprisingly to me at least, families aren't necessarily giving more financial support than they did 20 or 30 years ago. So they're giving the same total quantity of money, but over a longer period of time. And there's no evidence, there have been some research, some studies that looked at this, no evidence that just giving money tends to lead to unemployment or poor decisions for emerging adults, right? So just providing financial support, there's nothing about that inherently that's going to mess your kid's trajectory up. Giving support in the wrong ways can really cause problems, but just giving support isn't inherently problematic. So let's come back and close Olson Family. They're a perfect illustration of the way in which all of the possibilities of emerging adulthood lead to a lot of uncomfortable uncertainty. And they're a perfect example of a family where essentially all things that they've done in the past fail to work, and it makes them really anxious and pushes them off track. I think that most families are going to experience something like this at some point during the transition to adulthood. Now, basically, when you have kids in their 20s, early 30s, you're going to talk about some tough stuff and make some tough decisions. The best way to prepare for that is just to be really good and open at communicating with each other. I like to say communication doesn't solve all your problems. It's not magic, but lack of communication almost always makes your problems worse. And so I'm not trying to sell communication as a magic potion, but I think by engaging in good, intimate conversation, we come to know ourselves, we come to know each other, we come to know the communication techniques that we need to navigate the problems that are going to come up in the future. And that's really the best way of building strong relationships between emerging adults and their parents. So thank you. I would love to take questions now if you have any, so I'll turn it over to Cassie.
Awesome, Jacob. That was so great hearing your thoughts on the topic and your expertise. And we do have a question. And of course, I'll continue to encourage folks who are on the call to share any questions that you might have for Jacob, either through the Q&A tab or the chat tab, as we get into this great Q&A with him. And so to get us started, David has a kind of a three-part question asking, are there typical markers to reference for the emerging adult stage, an approximate age range, particular milestones like entering or graduating college, duration in a job or relationship?
So this is the great question for this. And the short answer is no, that part of the reason why emerging adults tend to seem like they are in more trouble than we might have during our transition to adulthood is because there are less typical markers and stages than there were. Let me give you an example. So researchers at the University of Virginia have identified what they call the cornerstone to capstone position. So folks essentially throughout time up to about the late 70s, early 80s, tended to view marriage as the cornerstone of adulthood. So it was essentially a marker for being an adult. You got married typically right out of college. Again, this isn't everyone, but on average. And marriage was your cornerstone. It was your launching point for becoming an adult. Now, starting the sort of late 80s, early 90s, and continuing to the present, people tend to see marriage as the capstone of adulthood, meaning they need to sort of make all of their life decisions, figure out exactly who they are, achieve some sort of sense of adult identity, and then cherry on top is marriage. And so it takes this very typical marker of marriage and moves it from the starting line to the finishing line, which in turn makes it much harder to figure out where you are in the process. For a lot of families, graduating college is a milestone for entering emerging adulthood as opposed to late adolescence. But no, I think here's what I would say. There may not be universal markers, but there are definitely markers within families. And so I think if an emerging adult is sort of dead set on being in one or another type of career, the family needs to have a conversation about, okay, how can we as parents know that you're on track with this career, right? And I think that's a really fabulous question. What are our markers going to be? Because it may not be marriage, it may not be achievement of a management role. Particularly, I think the statistic now is that people in their 20s on average live in 6 different houses, apartments before they reach age 30, which is much, much higher than it used to be. So what I do is I encourage families to set their own markers, because in some sense, the whole problem that we're talking about is that the universal markers don't exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And that kind of leads into another question I was thinking about is if you have multiple emerging adults in your family, and can those markers be different for each individual? You know, if you have children and they're all in their 20s, you know, how do you work through that?
Well, they have to be different. I mean, I've worked with families where, and I think very well-meaning parents have sort of came up with a plan that worked for emerging adult 1 and carried it out with emerging adult number 2 and number 3. And in one case with really bad results, right? Where essentially you had an older sister who asked for money, but parents sort of offered her a lot of money to supplement her being able to sort of move to a different city, to pursue a job that she really liked. And she took that and used it to just launch to the stars. Okay, and then they had the younger, they offered him the exact same thing. And he did nothing with it. And it sort of really wound up enabling him to not grow and develop. So first of all, you have to set different markers for different kids. Second of all, again, when giving support, you always have to start with, what do I know about this kid in particular that's going to help me know when to give support?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the question of like what's fair, because coming from a family where my parents are like the same for each person, and it doesn't always work the same for each person. So that's interesting. Donald has an interesting question that's been upvoted asking about multicultural families. We have a first-gen immigrant mom, professor dad, 20-year-old son, who sees the advantages of 2 cultures, but also feels stuck in the middle at times. Tips on navigating.
So in my head, when I think about differentiation, I think about this, I think about like, I need to learn to be very much me and also very much, right? So it's what I would call connected independence. So adult differentiation involves realizing that who you are as a complicated person is sort of validated and raised up by your connection to other people, as opposed to being diminished. So for me, and I think it's more complicated when you have parents who are a part of 2 different cultures, because the we that you're being a part of may not be so simple, right? Like, so if you have a family that is sort of just of one culture, and you've got a kid who's been grown up in that culture, it's a little simpler to say, how do I as a complicated person relate to that one culture? On the other hand, if you're now I've got at least 3 things I've got to think about. I've got to think about me as an independent person. I've got to think about, well, let's say maybe it's 4 things: me, the family, mom's culture, and dad's culture. right? So it's sort of four moving parts to balance. And part of what I would do as a parent in that case is do my best to imply that being oneself doesn't diminish connection to any of those groups. Okay, the metaphor I guess that I would use is if you were playing in a symphony and you were a violinist, the time that you spent practicing violin doesn't make you, like sort of on your own, doesn't make you a worse member of that symphony. It makes you a better member of that symphony. And if you want to go practice a different sort of music, ultimately, you don't want to imply that by practicing bluegrass fiddle, you're going to be a worse violinist in classical symphony. I'm not sure if that makes sense. That's the best metaphor that I have for essentially doing work on yourself in a way that allows you to become better parts of both of those communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And of course, if there are follow-up questions, it's really helpful, Jacob. If there are follow-up questions, feel free to send those in through the chat, but that's great. And John is asking how to go with emerging adults in newly blended families.
Yep. So this can be tricky depending on the level of comfort with intimate conversation. I can tell you what my dream goal would be. My dream goal would be an explicit conversation in which you talk about what it means to be a part of this blended family. Now, I think that there are people who are going to hear that and they're going to say, oh, no way can we sort of get that out. There's going to be way too much difficulty in having a conversation. But I think that's what you work toward. So when I've done work with blended families, sometimes I will have them sit down and write out like a mission statement for what does it mean to be a part of this family. How do we relate to each other? By making that stuff explicit, yes, in the short term, that might lead to some difficult emotions coming to the surface. I would say it's a heck of a lot better to get those emotions out there early on than to let them sort of stew and ferment sort of offstage left behind the scenes. So when I've worked in therapy with blended families with emerging adults, I want them to sort of come up with, it doesn't have to really be a document, they can just have this conversation about what does this mean to each of us? What do we mean to each other? Again, going back to the roles conversation, what are our roles vis-a-vis each other? The earlier on, the more explicit you can have that conversation, the better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And kind of switching gears to the perspective of the emerging adult, Melanie's writing, how do you approach when parents see their child's exploration instability going in a direction they see no future in? And I hear this a lot with, at Northwestern, picking certain things that their parents want versus other options, and how to work through that as the emerging adult.
So my answer here depends a lot on the situation. So this is one where I will fully admit that I feel torn how to answer, because there are times when the parents see no future and the kids do. And when we get into therapy, part of what I'm doing is helping the parents sort of get out of the way, and the kids need to go do it. On the other hand, a lot of times parents can really read the writing on the wall, right? And the kid is coming in and saying, I've got this master plan, and the parents are looking at the plan and they say, basically, this makes no sense. It's not going to work. At that point, there are a couple of things that parents can do. They can be open and honest about that. They can help the emerging adult explore other, maybe more sensible options to reach that end point. If you talk to people who are in a given career, you just talk to 50 people who, for example, became writers, or you talk to 50 people who became therapists, you'll probably hear 50 different stories about how they got an end point. And so one thing that parents can do is sit down with their kids and say, all right, we're not sure that this plan is feasible, but let's talk about all of the different more feasible options that you have to get to that goal. So I'm torn, because without knowing more about the situation, I don't know, is this a situation where the kid is really off base, or is this a situation where we have to help one or both parents to sort of take a step back? Now, If the parents take a step back, right, they can vote with the pocketbooks. So it's perfectly appropriate for parents to say, look, we don't agree with this plan, so we're going to set boundaries around support. That's okay. Again, that needs to be explicit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and figuring out what that end goal is and seeing if there are other options. Because I'm sure, as from the parent perspective, they want to support something that's going to be successful, and the emerging adult thinks this is going to be useful, and how to meet in between.
If you've got a kid living at home who doesn't have a job and who's proposing a sort of a basically outrageous plan that's not going to work and that's not making any, yes, parents absolutely need to set boundaries. I'm a big fan of like household contracts and household rules that are sort of explicitly written. So being able to say to your kid, okay, you want to go that path, that's fine with you, but right now we're financially supporting you. And the rule is, if you want our financial support, you need to do A and B and C. Or the alternative is, you can find a job and support yourself, and then you can make whatever decisions that you want about the direction you want to move in.
Mm-hmm. And thinking of those household contracts, I'm really curious what you typically recommend people put in there. I'm trying to think of, like, as an emerging adult, I've heard of parents charging their own kids rent. Is that a thing that you recommend?
Depends on the family. There's nothing that I think is like taboo. I think you need to be as explicit as possible. That is to say, as clear and specific as possible about what the rules are, and so what's to go in there. In short, sort of rights and responsibilities. Whose house is it for an emerging adult who's living at home? Whose house is this? I think that's a really tricky piece, because growing up as adolescents, we feel like this home is our home, ours and our parents' home. And then coming back as an emerging adult, it may not be our home. It may be, I'm living in mom and dad's home. And that can be a really tricky transition that people take really personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like some of these transitions are really tricky. David is writing in another question, asking about that transition point, asking, is it typical for adults to switch to using English with their parents when another language had always been used in the home before they were emerging adults?
It's extremely typical. So this is one really common way in which emerging adults will sort of hurt their sense of I and their adult identity, that I think can actually be really hurtful for parents. I think I've talked to a lot of parents who will feel like their emerging adults are suddenly sort of flaunting transitions in a way that maybe feels sort of more like immature and adolescent. And I think there's a fine line between self-differentiation and just sort of out and out rejection. But I would say it's very normal for emerging adults to ask, how can I be myself in relationship to you? And the language change for me is like, it's a super clear way of asserting that boundary, right? So if by being close to you, I lose my sense of individual identity, I'm going to do whatever I can to get that sense of individual identity back. And so language change is a really concrete way of doing it. Ultimately, it may not be the most mature way of doing it, right? You should be able to be close to your family without needing to sort of throw up barriers to create distance. But especially early in emerging adulthood, emerging adults are going to necessarily do whatever they need to create that distance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting that's typical, and you see that a lot. And Rachel is asking a question about what would you say about families adjusting to spouses with very different values, or seeing a spouse interacting in a negative with their emerging adult child?
This is a really tough one. That's a great question. And again, to some degree, my response differs a little bit based on sort of the details of the family, but let me take a crack at it more generally. So if there's sort of really negative interaction, I think that becomes a bit of a couple issue, and there needs to be a conversation about roles and values that happens not with the emerging adult in the room. Because as much as we want to say, like, eventually our kids become our peers as they get older, there's still a hierarchy. There's still sort of older peer, younger peer. And so you want to be careful about sort of not totally destroying that hierarchy in front of your kids. But I think this is a period of time when the values that parents have about, for example, support can go in very different directions. So, I can think about families that I work with all the time where one parent is very comfortable giving financial support and the other parent isn't. The one thing that you really avoid is what we'd call triangulation. So you don't want the parents fighting with each other through the kid. Okay, oh, your mom says you can't have this money, but don't tell her. I really disagree. I'm going to give you that money. That's a recipe for disaster. You also don't want the kid splitting the parents, right? So one way to deal with this is if you feel like you as parents are being cleaved apart by a kid who's sort of manipulating information, which happens, then you set a rule that everyone needs to talk together, right? So you set a rule that, at least for now, with this family, if we're going to get on a call and for example, if the kid is going to have support, even though the parents may not agree, let's get all three people on the phone and have that conversation together. And if you've got everyone in the room, that vastly minimizes the chances that either the kid can manipulate the parents or the parents can fight with each other through the kid.
Interesting. Yeah, it's fascinating how at different times you want conversations with the parents separately, and other times it's better to be all on the same page. And an interesting question that just came through is, about a list of roles and responsibilities. Curious your take on, who's in charge of starting these conversations.
So often it's the parents who are going to have to start. I would love it. And when I work with emerging adult clients, I push them really, really hard to be the ones to get in the driver's seat and start these conversations. There's the hierarchy, and often it's going to be the parents who are going to be in more of a leadership role. So if we were to go back a couple of slides, you just get up the typical sort of list of roles. So these are just roles. And you think about each of these roles has different responsibilities. So a student is there to learn. A student doesn't do a lot of decision making or a lot of having. So a student is a really good role for someone who's 18, 19, 20 to be in, maybe less of a great role for an adult member of the family to be in. A coach might have the responsibility of helping someone grow. Coach isn't going to solve your problems. On the other hand, a teacher or a supporter of some kind might be responsible for solving problems. One cool way to get at roles is to ask yourself, what if there was a sort of metaphor for our family, what would that metaphor be? Are we more like an orchestra or a sports team? Are we more like students in a classroom? Are we more, I did a talk recently where someone said their family felt like they were, as adults, that they were all different sorts of fish in an aquarium, which I feel like is a fantastic metaphor. So you start by asking yourself, if we were going to use a metaphor to describe ourselves as a group right now, what would that be? And then you work backwards from there to figure out what your roles are. I think that question also is about responsibilities. Responsibilities is a little trickier. So responsibilities could mean, if I'm the supporter, if I'm a parent, I'm the supporter, then my job is to provide a shoulder to cry on, maybe logistical support within a certain boundaried way. I'm giving some money. But responsibilities can also be much more concrete than that. I mean, it can be, if your kid is living at home, their responsibility is taking out the trash. Their responsibility is paying certain bills. Their responsibility is spending 5 hours a week on the computer applying to jobs. So we can get really, really concrete with responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And Jacob, we're getting close to 1 o'clock, but I have one more question I want to ask, and that's how to approach the conversations when one party doesn't want to engage in that conversation, whether it's the emerging adult trying to talk to a parent who says, no, this is your role, or vice versa.
So, a couple of things. One, not everyone is comfortable with face-to-face conversation. And that may not change, right? That, you say that may not change without therapy, but that may not change it. So I've had certain families that could never have this conversation about roles sitting around in the living room. But you get them out taking a walk together, and suddenly we're not sort of sitting, straight looking at each other and making eye contact, but we're just sort of walking together, and it becomes much, much easier to have the conversation. So one thing that I would say is if someone doesn't want to come to the table, be very flexible about how the conversation is going to happen. Ultimately, although we don't want to set ultimatums, sometimes these conversations, especially the ones about support, are necessary to have. And as parents, we need to assess, where are we willing to draw a boundary? So if I say, I'm not going to give you money until you come sit down and we have a conversation about support, or I'm not going to agree to have you move back in until we agree to sit down and have a conversation about support. First and foremost, right, you need to be willing to follow through with that. So don't set any boundaries that you're not willing to keep. Otherwise, that just completely reinforces the avoidant behavior. And then the other thing that I would say is, if these conversations feel too deep, start really surface level. You can absolutely talk about more fun, calmer, less intimate things, way of getting deeper into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And this, Jacob, it's been so great spending this hour with you. We still have questions coming in, but I know that I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and a minute or two if you have anything else you'd like to share before we end for the day.
The main thing that I want to share is that I'm excited that we're having this conversation. And to go back to something that I said at the beginning that is really true, I think if families come in and there are really difficult turning points, so for example, an emerging adult loses a job, or God forbid, someone has a serious health problem, or someone in the family sort of goes in a direction that really doesn't fit with everyone else's values. If they've practiced these sort of skills, I'm always amazed. I have families that come in that have problems that I think this is going to take months of therapy to untangle. But then when we start talking, it's clear that they're really good at being connected with one another. We get through those problems so quickly. It's amazing to me. And so, to me, all of this material is coming out of the things that I see really optimized families do every day. And on the other hand, again, when I've got families who come in and they're sort of relatively minor problems, but they've never practiced sitting down and talking with each other, way longer than I expect. So hopefully that incentivizes you to get out there and have these conversations. Do this in any way or style that fits for you. And I'm excited about making it.
Yeah, and we really appreciate you for sharing all this really helpful information and spending this time with us. So thank you again, Jacob. And thanks to everybody for tuning in today. We had a lot of really great questions and a good conversation. I have our first slide up from the presentation in case you guys want to contact Jacob, and we will be sharing out the link to the recording later today. You can find all of our archived and upcoming webinars on our website at alumni.northwestern.edu/career webinars, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day, and go Cats.
Thanks.